We'll wait about 5 minutes for people to roll in.
Awesome. And are you going to sort of just start it off with like an introduction or something like that? Or
Yeah, I'll introduce you if you want, unless you want to introduce yourself.
I mean, I'm going to probably just do a brief introduction, but if you want to just like get things started, feel free to do so.
Yeah, sure. All right, we'll probably get started in a bit, but I'll start with some introductions. So, hi everyone. My name is Michael. I'm a community manager here at Bit Project, the person behind the Gameathon, and I'm currently going to be the moderator for this workshop. I am, however, not the host. The host here is Alex. He's the president of the Harvard Game Dev Club. Alex, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Alex, as Michael mentioned. I am one of the co-presidents of the Harvard College Video Game Development Club. At Harvard, what we basically do is we're a student-run organization that's sort of dedicated towards building games throughout a year-long cycle, and also just making talks like this one that are sort of available to the public just on our YouTube channel about game design, game development, just software coding in general, art styles, music, things like that. If you want to learn more about us, feel free to go to the link in the slides. I'll show it again near the end so that if you want to copy it down later. you can. But yeah, that's all I really have to say before we get started. Anything else, Michael?
Yeah, I'm just for everyone in the chat who's watching this live. Uh, I'm going to be here moderating. I'll be looking at questions, things like that. So if you have any questions for Alex, just to go ahead and type them into the Twitch chat, and I will relay them to him. And he'll give them his best answers. So yeah, feel free to get started when you're ready, Alex.
All right, cool. I'll have time for at the end for questions. But if there are any, I might take pauses in between as well. We'll see how sort of things go along. But yes, let's see. Everyone can see that? Awesome. Cool. So today I'm going to be talking about sort of where to take your game after the game jam is done. I know you've all been sort of working on your projects for, I believe, 2 weeks now, and things are sort of beginning to wrap up and come to a close. And I know many of you may be thinking, oh God, I need to get this project done. The art's still not in. The music is still playing wrong. It's like maybe it's playing in reverse or something. I don't know. And there's just like a bunch of stress going on before you reach the deadline. But I'm willing to bet that some of you are also thinking, okay, once I'm done, once I've submitted my project and I get the feedback from either judges or fellow developers, whatever, whenever I get that feedback back, what am I going to do with my game next? Do I want to take it to the next level? Do I want to try and develop it further? Or do I just want to say, okay, I'm happy with the experience I had here. I'm going to move on to maybe the next game jam or something like that. That's sort of what I wanted to sort of tackle in this talk is sort of where do you bring your game after you're done the jam? What sort of things should you consider when sort of trying to bring it to the next level, or whether to bring it to the next level at all? So to begin with, here are 4 games, somewhat well known, depending on just I guess your background and how much you've heard of these specific games. But I guess maybe the talk sort of gives it away. But what sort of things do these games have in common is sort of what we're going to be focusing on here. Goat Simulator is sort of a 3-dimensional game where you sort of sandbox style, where you sort of go around and be a goat and cause chaos. Super Hot is more of a first-person action game where time only moves where you do, sort of polygon style art aesthetic, but still very well made. Super Hexagon is very 2-dimensional, action-packed. I believe it's also has been released on the mobile, very abstract aesthetic. And then Please Don't Touch Anything, which is more of just a exploration, but a little bit of puzzle elements and sort of riddle elements as well. 2-dimensional game. So yeah, what sort of do these all have in common? I don't know if Chad is actually responding or not to this, but
Yeah, no, there isn't a ton of participation.
all right, no worries. But yeah, just you may be able to infer from the talk anyways. But all of these sort of started as game jams actually, and they aren't the only ones. Here is a full, so well, maybe not even a full list. These are just sort of the ones I wanted to highlight. Some of the more well-known ones, in my opinion. We have Goat Simulator, Super Hot, Super Hexagon, Please Don't Touch Anything, as I mentioned earlier. But we also have games like Surgeon Simulator, sort of you just try and perform surgery with very interesting control schemes, sort of 3-dimensional games. We have Binding of Isaac, which is more of a roguelike type game, where you sort of explore this twisted dungeon of sorts. Broforce, more of a just sort of shoot 'em up game, just run and gun type style. Celeste, more of a just difficult platformer, great story, great art. And then Baba Is You as well is sort of a puzzle game with sort of takes interesting quirks about the English language and sort of sentence structure and turns it into a puzzle riddle game. So all of these games started as game jams, and I'll get to the one that's highlighted in yellow in a second. But just some things to note is that a lot of these games have very small teams of like maybe 2 to 3 people. Some of them were made by more sort of larger studios, but things like Super Hexagon was made by like a single person. Um, so yeah, just sort of things to think about as you sort of continue onward. You don't necessarily need a large team to sort of turn your game jam game into a full-fledged game with sort of a successful release. Um, Now, Hollow Knight I have highlighted in yellow, mainly because this is sort of the one I'm going to be focusing on throughout today's talk. It's not because necessarily I like Hollow Knight better than any of these other games or it's more successful than any of these other games, but simply because it's very well documented in how the game jam inspired the game, and also the fact that the game jam game is still playable today on Newgrounds, and I'll get to that in a second. But for those of you who don't know what Hollow Knight is, here is a brief sort of introduction to it. It's a 2D action adventure Metroidvania, and Metroidvania is sort of a term that comes from the games Metroid and Castlevania, where the style of gameplay is two-dimensional, but you have these expansive levels where certain progress points are sort of blocked off by ability checks, where you'll sort of head to one area, maybe realize you can't progress in that area, head somewhere else, get a power-up, and then have to backtrack to the other area to sort of progress throughout the map. And as you sort of progress with more power-ups, you gain more power-ups, you unlock new places to get more power-ups, sort of the core gameplay loop, and you expand upon the map to some overall goal. As you can see, we sort of have some, I guess here, we have some pretty basic GIFs of Hollow Knight. The one on the left is sort of from an in-game cutscene. You can see it's very well drawn, movement's very smooth, and the one on the right is from one of the trailers of the game. And you can see that just sort of some of the gameplay, again, the aesthetic is very consistent throughout it, but it has sort of very fast-paced combat, and you may be able to tell a lot of in-game, like in-air control as sort of part of its movement. Now, this game is very large. It's had several free DLCs on top of a very extensive map, which is very common for Metroidvanias. And it's been released on several platforms from the Xbox One, Xbox S Series S, Nintendo Switch, PS4, Steam, and other PC distributors. And it was developed by 3 people. And it was developed actually in Unity primarily, which I know is sort of a program that has been used throughout this game jam. So that's something also to note. But also with some prototyping in Stencil and the art in Photoshop. Not sure exactly what the music program was used, but we'll get to music a bit later as well. So at this point, you're maybe thinking, okay, this is clearly a very well-made game. Some would say that is one of the best indie Metroidvanias out there. Why is he showing us this as sort of the example to strive to? This very well-made game. Clearly, whatever Game Jam game preceded it must have won first prize, must have been also artistically incredible, must have been invigorating, must have been giant. And you're probably sort of correlating the quality of this final game to sort of the Game Jam. So what I'm going to show you might surprise you a little bit. So here is Hungry Night. It is one of the 2 game jams that inspired the creation of Hollow Knight, as you may be able to tell from the sort of main character focused on this in this video. And it was a game jam game for Ludum Dare 27 back in 2013 with the theme of 10 seconds. Now, originally, I was going to actually play this game for you. Again, as I mentioned, it's available on Newgrounds. If you just search up Hungry Night, you should be able to play it yourself. Give it a try. But just to minimize the amount of times I need to switch between screens, I'm just going to start playing this video instead. Now, I believe you shouldn't be able to hear the sound, but just simple introduction, and we have our character here. And you might immediately notice this doesn't really look like the gameplay footage in that, firstly, it's top-down rather than sort of the 2D Metroidvania style. Additionally, as we'll sort of begin to note, there's only 3 types of enemies, and the gameplay loop is really quite simple. You essentially need to go around, kill these bugs, and get these orange berries almost to keep your hunger meter from running out, which drains in 10 seconds, which is where the theme comes in. But overall, the enemies have very predictable attacks. If you kill the big ones, these masks come off. And just the general aesthetic is you're sort of on this strange plateau just in the sky, sort of, and you're just going around collecting juices and things like that. You can't hear it, but the music is also very simple. All the enemies, I believe, have just the same death sound pitched up and down. The music is sort of just a small loop. And while the art style is pretty good, as we'll get to later, when you collect all the masks, you enter a cutscene. And we can see that some of the art here is a bit fuzzy around the edges, in that it isn't as sort of clean and vectorized as the art in the GIF that we saw earlier. We also see Team Terry made by 3 people. But yes, it has a very simple story and things like that. So what I want to highlight here is that this game is quite different from Hollow Knight in quite a few ways, though there's some interesting similarities, and this will sort of be how I sort of progress through the talk, and sort of using this as an example. So when it comes to the art, clearly there's a very similar aesthetic going on, especially with the knight, was literally almost taken directly from this game, put into Hollow Knight, just the same overall style. But a lot of the enemies are very similar. We saw there was like at some point there was this enemy that had the orange berry and then also the purple berry, just as a way of distinguishing it, which is a slight change in color. And we also saw that the cutscene is a lot more, well, less polished, and just the art in general can be a bit repetitive for this indie game, which is not the case in necessarily Hollow Knight, which has hundreds of different enemies, each with their own very interesting designs, different locations, so on and so forth. For the gameplay, we have almost a complete change in style, from what was sort of a 2D Metroidvania to now sort of a top-down survival where you sort of just move up, down, left, and right, and just sort of go around collecting berries. It's a very, very different core gameplay loop. And you're probably wondering, okay, well then how did they get to Metroidvania? Where did that come from? And I mentioned there were sort of two game jams that inspired it. Team Cherry only actually participated in one game jam, this one here, but they were inspired by the theme of another game jam, specifically Beneath the Surface, and that sort of led their development, from where they took this game and then they sort of said, okay, we're going to start changing some things to sort of incorporate this beneath the surface element, and that sort of led to the Metroidvania Deep Underground. Though I will also mention, you may have noticed that the knight was sort of dashing around and slashing. That is kept in the final game as well. So there's some things that were kept, some things that were changed, and that's going to be sort of a common theme that I'm going to be talking about a bit later. For the music, I'll briefly gloss over this one because I don't think you guys were able to hear it. But there is sort of a simple loop of the music, and in the final game, it's actually very well composed by Christopher Larkin, who was hired by Team Cherry using Kickstarter money. But finally, just story. There are some elements that are similar. I'm not going to give too much spoilers for Hollow Knight, and Hollow Knight is very intensive in its lore and story. Where this one, it's more just like collect 3 masks and there's orange liquid that you eat. But those sort of are reimagined in Hollow Knight. So what was the point of me showing this to you? The point was more to say that Hungry Knight didn't really win any awards. Hungry Knight wasn't necessarily groundbreaking in its approach, and while it did have a cool art aesthetic and some things that would later show up in Hollow Knight and be praised for, it wasn't necessarily a outstanding game by any means. So I think that's sort of important to keep in mind when we sort of see these game jam games that sort of became super successful, is that just because that the final project was super successful doesn't mean that the original game was also super successful, and that you can sort of take a rough idea and sort of polish it over the course of a long time. So let's see. Okay. So now that we have sort of this base idea, I'm going to sort of talk about 5 main considerations. Specifically, what worked in your game jam, what didn't, um, picking your tools and team for developing the project further, nailing down the fundamental core gameplay loop, and then just some timeline and additional notes. I'm going to be talking about what Hollow Knight did as sort of an example through all these, but I'm also going to present a game that I made for Game Jam and sort of as an example of what I would do if I wanted to sort of take this game to the next level. Now, I'm going to attempt to swap screens at the moment. We will see how this goes. Give me a quick second. Let us see. Okay, so you should be able to see. Okay, cool. This is Prism. It's a game that me and 2 other people worked on. I believe it was either last December or the December before that. And it's a very simple game. I'm just going to play a little bit just so you get the idea of what I wanted to keep and change. You control this little box, and you jump in the air. And I'm going to okay. So you jump in the air. You press R to reset. Very simple controls. The only real interesting thing is that as you jump, you essentially waste these color points. And just your goal is to essentially get through the level. And once you do, Once you do, you lose a color and it activates things in the level. It's sort of the key mechanic. Now these bowls will sort of shoot you over the lava, so on and so forth. Some interesting things to note, just that I'll touch on later, is this water will always kill you even when it's not active, but this lava only kills you when it is active. Additionally, there wasn't a lot of feedback, and a lot of people complained that they didn't really know they could double jump until they sort of spammed it out of frustration. Just some things that I'm going to touch on a little bit later. Um, Additionally, the music sort of loops as you play through the game. Unfortunately, I don't think you can hear that, but it sort of builds upon itself every single time you hit the prism. A new layer of instruments is added. All right, so that's basically all you need to know for what I'm going to be talking about in a couple seconds. Let me swap back to the slides. Let's see, I think it's this one. There we go. Okay, awesome. So that's Prism, and it's just sort of as a way for me to say, okay, here's what I'm going to change, here's what I'm going to keep the same, and sort of use that as an example for that you guys can sort of follow along with whatever project you may have. Okay. So firstly, what worked? And you may be inclined to say, well, okay, I want to use everything from my game. I want to take my game jam game, and I think it's great. I want to use all of these elements, and I want to take them all into the final project. And it can be very tempting to do that. It can be very tempting to get locked into a specific idea. But when it came to what Hollow Knight did, they kept certain things. They focused on very specific things. They kept the aesthetic, they kept sort of the dashing and slashing, and they kept specific story elements. But a lot of things they changed, which is a very bold move on their part. They were willing to completely change their genre in order to better serve these elements. And I think that's sort of very important, that you don't try and necessarily keep the entirety of your game jam game. You've made it within 48 hours, or I guess in this case, 2 weeks. And overall, in the terms of the large cycle of making a game, that isn't a lot of time. So it's okay to change things at this early step and let go of things that are sort of hindering other sort of key aspects. So for Prism, I would say sort of the key aspect is sort of just the theme of sort of giving up things as a form of progressing the difficulty. Just the building music was really cool. A lot of people mentioned that in the comments. And then just the overall looping level idea. So just, and a lot of these sort of build on each other. The idea of theme going into the looping level to create difficulty, and the building music to going into the looping level as you sort of progress over it and over it. That's sort of just like a brief idea of how I would do it. But specifically, you want to focus on your key ideas. What makes your game interesting? What makes your game fun? Once you have those, you got to think for every other thing that wasn't necessarily a key idea, does this help build towards and support these key elements, or are they sort of detracting in some way? I'll talk about that a bit more as when we get to what didn't work. So yeah, what do you wish to keep as you move forward to the project? And then what elements do you want to expand upon and focus the design around? Having this key focus will enable you to sort of not get bogged down by necessarily like, oh, if I'm going to keep everything to fix this particular bug, or I need to do this particular thing. If you have sort of a new sort of design philosophy around a specific core element, then you can focus on expanding that core, and then once you have that core, expanding around it, as we'll touch on a bit later as well. So then what didn't work? Obviously, for everything that works, you're going to have something that just didn't get across. For Hollow Knight, this was the genre. Just the survival, moving up, down, left, and right, and killing like 3 enemies wasn't very fun. The setting got completely changed as well. As we mentioned, we were on this sort of floating plateau in the sky, just in broad daylight. And you may have seen from the clips of Hollow Knight, it takes place in a very dark setting underground. It sort of builds to the idea that you're exploring this vast underground network. And the music got completely overhauled to the point where they hired Chris Larkin to compose music for the game. And that really worked out in their favor, that decision. So for Prism, I would probably say the things that didn't work is there was a complete lack of feedback when you jumped. Sure, there was like the bar that went down like slightly, but unless you had already been pressing double jump, you wouldn't really notice that. And there was a lot of comments on that game that they didn't really understand it until the third loop, and then they were like, wait a minute, I'm running out of jumps. So I think just general feedback and also difficulty was a problem within Prism. And as you notice, I'm referencing comments because this particular game jam let other people vote on each other's. And so comments can be a very good way to sort of get information about what didn't work. And I'm not saying to necessarily treat all comments as sort of like the end all be all. So if like someone says, oh, your jump is terrible in this game, so on and so forth, then maybe think, rather than saying, okay, I have to get rid of the jump entirely, think, why was this person frustrated? What can I do to better uh, bring across the core gameplay elements that I want to focus on, and what should just be discarded and completely. For example, in Prism, the a lot of the animals just didn't work. They were sort of just like skins of each other. Some that just shot you up without really a lot of thought to how that level design built around that, which led to difficulty problems and progressions. So when you're thinking about this, you just need to think about what didn't work well in the game jam from both the personal perspective, what was maybe when you implemented it at the last moment just to get something done, and maybe you're like, I really don't like how that ended up playing. For example, in Prism, a lot of the spiders, they sort of drag you up, but it was incredibly slow and just hindered the entire gameplay progress. So what did players not understand as well? Sort of, was there things that just prevented players from understanding? For example, um, let's say when I first played the Hungry Knight, I didn't realize that you had to collect the mask. I thought it was just a simple survival game where you're like, okay, just survive as long as you can. So what better ways can we sort of get them to realize that this is sort of the goal of our game? What sort of feedback did you receive on your submission? Both positive and negative can be very helpful. Just make sure, take them as, just look at them, see if there's any common themes among them. And then finally, what other sources of inspiration can you draw upon to improve your game? So as I mentioned earlier, Hollow Knight was inspired by two game jams, both Hungry Knight and the one where it was Beneath the Surface as a sort of idea. And even though they didn't actually compete in the Beneath the Surface game jam, it was still very integral to sort of shifting Hollow Knight from a top-down, above-the-ground thing to a Metroidvania with like deep underground tunnels that you have to explore. So bringing in inspiration and being okay with, mostly this whole slide is just being okay with changing your core game. A lot of the times when you are sort of building a project, you can get stuck in this rut that like, oh no, my game has to be this way, even if it's sort of hindering the fun of the game. So you need to be able to be flexible as you're sort of building your game and think that it's not really an end all be all. All right, cool. Um, Next is sort of picking your tools and team. So I mentioned Hollow Knight was made in Unity, which is sort of one of the two game engines that you guys are all using. They also use Stencil, they use Photoshop, and for Hollow Knight, they also about partway through they made a Kickstarter because they realized that they were lacking in the music department, and it takes a lot of foresight and just sort of self-awareness to realize that maybe my team doesn't have this particular aspect. How am I going to overcome it? In this case, they did it via Kickstarter and then hiring a composer, just adding someone to the team, so to speak. If I were to do this with Prism, I made Prism in GameMaker, and there's nothing wrong with GameMaker, but I would probably swap to Unity specifically because I'm now I'm just more interested in Unity nowadays, and I've been sort of playing around with it, and I would like to continue playing around with it. Um, and I think also maybe swapping to a different engine is not the worst thing in the world because it sort of forces you to, as mentioned earlier, throw things away and then rebuild it from the ground up. If you're just building upon an already existing project, there's sort of the temptation to keep things the same as you've already done it, and it would be harder to sort of remake it. But by sort of either switching to a different game engine or maybe making it from scratch in a new project, to sort of having the ideas and sort of the learning, what you learn from the game jam in mind, you can sort of force yourself to say, okay, since I'm building it from the ground up, I might as well change this thing because it's going to be as much work to re-implement it versus change it. So it gives you a lot more freedom. Additionally, I worked with two other people from the club. I would probably consider getting those two people back together. But when you're doing that, you need to make sure that the other people would also be willing to commit to this much larger project. For example, for a game jam, they can vary for a couple days to a couple weeks. That's much different than sort of working on a full-on project, and you need to make sure your team is sort of committed to doing that. So just general things to think about. What tools will you use moving forward? Are there certain ones that you like? Are there certain ones that have specific advantages of being able to be ported to specific platforms? Is it worth it to rebuild your game in a new engine? Would that help you necessarily in the process of uh, sort of freeing yourself from these ideas that you have about the specific game that you need to make? And are you and your fellow Game Jam members willing to commit to a larger project? As I'll talk about in a second, these things take quite a lot of time. And finally, should you bring in initial help? Once you have a team, what are your weaknesses and how are you going to overcome those weaknesses? Are you going to do it by necessarily maybe designing your game around a simple art style if you don't have a lot of art aesthetic? Or are you going to hire someone via maybe Kickstarter or some other money funding operation? So once you have your team, you realize what your core is and you realize what you're going to throw away. Then I think the next step and the step that sort of Team Cherry took is to nail down the fundamentals. You want to make sure that your core gameplay is fun before you start adding other things to it. In Hollow Knight, this was specifically the movement and combat. Specifically, the devs talked about how they focus entirely on getting the movement just right, making sure you could have a lot of mobility in air, and making sure that the movement and the combat really played together well. For Prism, I would suggest probably what I would do is I would get the movement to work again, but I would also really focus on the animal interactions and just rework those from the ground up to ensure that the puzzle elements of the puzzle platformer is really just fun and like it actually has ways of scaling with difficulty. Um, so really, what is the core gameplay loop? This will be sort of tied into the first question I asked, which is what was fun about your original game, and do the controls feel good with this core gameplay loop? For example, if Hollow Knight had a jump that took 10 seconds to just jump into the air, and all the enemies move very fast at you, then it's going to feel terrible as you're going to get hit just because you can't jump fast enough. And that might be a bit of an exaggerated example, but a lot of the times you got to make sure your controls really play well with your gameplay loop. And if they don't, then you got to think, well, are these controls fun or is this gameplay loop fun? Um, for example, maybe you want a slower paced game, in which case you would turn down the speed of the enemies, or maybe you want a faster paced game, in which case you would change the control scheme to match. And it's really just all about sort of questioning and making sure that you have the ability to sort of change things up as you need to. So do the controls feel good? Does the core gameplay fit the game you want to build? And once you have these fundamentals, how are you going to expand upon them? So it's all well and good to have a sort of fun core, but then how will you scale that with difficulty? Is your game scalable at all? And then so this leads to the final point, which is timeline and additional notes. So Hollow Knight, the Hungry Knight game jam was released in 2013 for that game. Hollow Knight itself released in 2017 and has since had additional DLC updates, and there's a sequel that has been announced as well. This is a 4-year commitment for these three people. And while Hollow Knight is a large game, at the same time, you got to realize that this is essentially the equivalent of going to a university for just an undergraduate degree. This is not a trivial amount of time, like 2 weeks or a couple days. So when you're thinking, okay, am I going to expand upon my game jam? I think it's really important that you focus on the fact that these are long-term projects that you're going to be going into. So you need to make sure before you do that you are interested in continuing this project for set amount of time. But yeah, so are you really willing to commit to a long-term project? Are your team members willing to commit to this long-term project? And more importantly, is your game scalable enough to commit to a long-term project? If it's focused around a very specific gimmick, then if you wanted to sort of expand upon that gimmick, then you might find that the gimmick really only has like about an hour's worth of gameplay or something like that, or like a couple minutes worth of gameplay or something like that, and that it's really hard to expand upon. So that's something to think about when you're trying to decide whether you want to continue to scale your project. And then once you sort of think, okay, I'm committed to, me and my team are committed to spending this long term on this, and I believe my game is scalable. You need to also think about where you're going to release your game. So Hollow Knight was released on most of the major consoles and PC, but let's say you were trying to make a mobile game, your control scheme is going to be very different than if you were making a VR game, for example. So you need to sort of have these ideas in mind. I would say this last slide is not necessarily a super starting point, but just something to consider as for the overarching plans of the project. But yeah, I think if you focus on those sort of five key points, you're definitely on a strong way to sort of start your project. And at that point, it's just mostly getting into it and building it. So these are just sort of some overview things that you really want to consider, whether you want to bring your game jam to the next level. But yeah, that's mostly what I had here. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to take them now.
Yeah, we've got one question in the chat. What would some of the financial aspects be in a game development process? I guess that's asking, if you've got a Kickstarter or something, what sort of costs are actually associated with the game? You mentioned developing or, hiring a composer besides that sort of thing.
Right. Okay. So I would say that. So first of all, there's a question of how do you raise money. Specifically, I would say for most indie developers, that's going to be primarily through a platform like Kickstarter. And then there's a whole different argument of like, what should I put on my Kickstarter? How much demo gameplay should I say? What promises should I make? So on and so forth. But once you have the money, I would say sort of the main costs will be yes. Where does the actual money end up going? So usually you're going to have to, first of all, if you're committing to a long-term project, a lot of these people will sort of take this as their sort of job. So like you won't necessarily, if you're going to be committing to 4 years, then you have to essentially make enough money to survive on for 4 years, and so on and so forth. So a lot of the money just goes into paying the developers just a living wage, but also paying other people outside. For example, if you want to have your game ported, you might need to pay a specific company if you don't really have the technical expertise to do that yourselves. As mentioned earlier, Chris Larkin with the composing is another cost, and then also I believe certain engines will cost money, and certain programs will cost money. For example, Photoshop, I believe, and just the Adobe products is sort of a subscription-based service. So if you don't have like access to that via like a university or like some other company way in, then you're going to have to start paying for that monthly essentially, and there's going to be costs associated with that. Additionally, you're going to want to probably pay marketing of some sort, unless different marketing firms for like making trailers, things like that, also comes into a cost. Sort of one-time things, depending on whether you want to do voice acting, things like that, could be more cost. There's essentially a lot of very different costs, and it will vary a bit depending on what your game is and what your game requires. But it is good to have some extra money just around, especially if you're sort of a small team that maybe has a couple gaps, as mentioned earlier, where you're going to need to find ways to fill in those gaps and compensate for them.
Yeah, so unless anybody else has any last second questions, I think that's going to be about it. So
Yeah.
I'd say thank you again to Alex and to Harvard Game Dev Club as a whole. To anyone who's watching this either live or in the future through a VOD, feel free to check them out. You can see their link there on the stream. And yeah, thanks everyone.
Yep, you
and
too.
Alex, have a nice day.